Hello again, my dreaming souls. Tonight, we step into the arena, not the one from the movies, polished and heroic, but the real one. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the brutal, bloody truth behind one of history's most misunderstood roles, the Roman gladiator. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more forgotten truths, and let us know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now dim the lights, let the roar of the crowd fade, and listen closely, because in ancient Rome, entertainment came at a price. This is why being a Roman gladiator wasn't as cool as the movies say.
So, you think you would have made a good gladiator. Maybe you've watched the movies. Imagine stepping into the Colosseum with the sun catching just the right angle on your bronze helmet, sword in hand, crowd at your back. Maybe you see yourself as the lone hero, fearless, lean, brooding. But let's rewind a bit. Let's take away the camera angles, the dramatic music, and the clean, cinematic dust. Because being a gladiator was not a heroic path, it was a punishment, a death sentence, a business. And for the vast majority who ended up in the arena, it was about as glamorous as sleeping in a sewer and being cheered on while someone tried to disembowel you. Let's start with your morning. Assuming you're still alive, that is. You would have woken up not in a private chamber but in a cramped, dark, reeking cell inside a training school called a ludus. It would be noisy men groaning, coughing, shuffling around on straw mats. You might be chained to a wall, or if you were one of the better performers, maybe just locked behind thick bars. Forget feather pillows. Your bedding was usually a pile of straw that smelled like every other sweaty gladiator who had used it before you. Sanitation was not exactly a Roman priority when it came to prisoners. You did not wake gently. You were kicked, shouted at, or startled by the clatter of a wooden training sword against the iron bars. If you were lucky, breakfast came next. And let's not romanticize that either. Gladiators were fed a highly regulated diet designed not for speed or agility, but for bulk and stamina. They were called horderii, which basically means barley men. You got barley porridge, maybe some beans or lentils, and the occasional sour wine or vinegar water to wash it all down. Meat was rare unless you won a fight or had a wealthy sponsor. The goal was to fatten you up, not for health, but to give your body enough padding to survive cuts. Fatter gladiators bled more impressively, but died a little slower, which was great for the crowd. Then came training, which was long, brutal, and repetitive. From sunup until near sunset, you drilled under the supervision of a lanista part coach, part prison warden. These men did not care about your personal story, your dreams, or whether you used to be a farmer or soldier or just someone who said the wrong thing at the wrong time. Their job was to shape you into a weapon. You were trained to fight with wooden swords weighted heavier than real weapons. You were taught how to fall, how to block, how to die in a way that pleased the crowd. And this training happened outside, under the Roman sun, often in dirt arenas surrounded by high walls and leering spectators who could peek in through slits. The heat was exhausting. The armor scratched. The wooden sword splintered your palms. The lanista carried a whip. He used it. You were expected to improve or suffer, and improvement meant pain. Broken bones, bruised ribs, dislocated shoulders, none of that got you a rest day. If you could stand, you could fight. And fight you did, often against your fellow prisoners, sometimes with dulled weapons, sometimes not. If a man died during training, there might be a murmur of regret, but usually it just meant more food for the rest of you and a reminder to keep your guard up. Outside of training, the life of a gladiator was a strange blend of celebrity and slavery. The Roman public adored you from a distance. You might be the subject of street gossip. Artists painted your likeness on walls. Wealthy women whispered your name during parties. Some of them even paid for secret visits. Gladiators were oddly eroticized, both admired and reviled. People loved the fantasy, the blood, the danger, the sculpted bodies, but they rarely thought of you as fully human. You were property, entertaining property, like a circus tiger or a racehorse. And that meant you could be sold, traded, punished, or killed on a whim. Your lanista had full control over you. He could lease you to a distant arena or deny you food if he felt your performance was lacking. He might even rent you out for banquets where you would serve guests while wearing armor for amusement. Or worse, fight mock battles in someone's backyard while senators laughed and sipped watered wine. But let's talk about the arena, the part everyone imagines. Let's say you made it that far. You're fed, bruised, and still breathing. You're scheduled for a match in the amphitheater. Maybe even the Colosseum if you were well known. That morning, you'd be oiled up, dressed in your armor, assuming you were not in the class of unarmed victims thrown to wild animals for sport and paraded in front of the crowd. The crowd was vast, tens of thousands, some of them drunk, many of them screaming your name or betting on your blood. Women wept. Children pointed. The air was filled with the smell of sweat, dust, animal dung, and anticipation. Trumpets sounded. A sponsor or noble might step forward to make a speech. Then you were shoved into the ring with another man who, like you, had something to lose. And then the fight began. You did not fight to win a war. You fought to survive. Each opponent came with his own style, his own weapons. You might be a secutor, armed with a short sword and shield. Or maybe a retiarius, armed only with a net and trident. Some men had helmets with narrow eye slits. Others wore nothing at all on their heads, making it easier for the crowd to see the blood. The fights were choreographed to a degree, especially in the early empire, but they were still dangerous. People died. Even if you survived, your body told the story scarred, battered, and older than your years. And if you lost, the worst moment came not with a blade, but with a hand. The sponsor might turn to the crowd. The audience would shout and gesture. Thumbs up or down, although in truth, the gestures were more complex. A signal, a call, a whim. And then, if it was decided, the victor would be told to end it. You might be given a moment to kneel. You might be allowed to speak a final word. Or maybe you would be struck from behind, in the neck, quick and brutal. And if you won, you got a moment of applause, maybe a little money, maybe a wreath. You would be dragged out, bloodied, alive, and sent back to the ludus, to sleep on your straw, to eat your barley, and to hope that, the next time, your luck would hold. In the next part, we will look at how the whole gladiator system was born, who built it, why it became so central to Roman life, and what it said about the empire itself. Because behind the noise and blood, the arena was not just entertainment. It was a mirror one that reflected the values of an empire both brilliant and brutal. By the time a Roman gladiator stepped into the arena, he was already part of a system older and stranger than most people realize. Gladiator fights did not begin in the Colosseum. They did not start with emperors or massive crowds. They came from something darker, something smaller, something far more personal. It began with funerals. Back in the early days of the Roman Republic, when the city was still carving itself out between hills and fields, funerals for noblemen sometimes included a special send-off. To honor the dead, 2 slaves would fight to the death at the graveside. Blood would be spilled as an offering to the spirits, a way to give the soul of the deceased a strong escort into the afterlife. That sounds grim, because it was. There were no cheers, no popcorn. It was about ritual, not entertainment. But as with many things in Roman life, a little blood turned into a lot. As time went on, wealthy families began to compete, not just in funerals, but in spectacle. One family hosted 2 fighters. The next one hosted 10. The crowd grew. People began attending these events not to mourn the dead, but to watch the violence, and the Roman elite, never once to pass up an opportunity for power or applause, leaned into it. By the late Republic, public games had become a way to win votes. Politicians sponsored them to build popularity. The bigger the show, the better the chances at election. If your favorite gladiator survived the fight and your sponsor paid for it, you remembered that name come voting day. It became political theater and eventually state policy. By the time the empire rolled in, gladiator games were no longer occasional events. They were part of the Roman calendar. Festivals, religious ceremonies, military victories, they all included public games. Emperors used them to distract, reward, and control the masses. A bored city was a dangerous city. A cheering one was easy to manage. And so the games became bigger, louder, bloodier. And so did the arenas. The Colosseum, the most famous of all, was not just a sports stadium, it was a message. Built by the Flavian emperors, especially Vespasian and Titus, it rose from the ruins of Nero's private palace as a gift to the people. It said, "We took the land from a tyrant, and now we give it back to you." Free shows, bread and entertainment, the people cheered, and the Colosseum roared. But the gladiators? They were never the main attraction at first. The early shows featured wild animals, lions, leopards, elephants, bears. They were brought in from every corner of the empire. Some were trained to perform tricks. Others were used in staged hunts. Sometimes they were set loose on prisoners or criminals, men and women condemned to death for real crimes or simply for being in the wrong class. But the gladiators were different. They were professionals, sort of. Most gladiators were slaves, captured in war or sold by debt-ridden families. Some were criminals sentenced to the arena instead of execution. A few volunteered desperate men looking for fame, money, or a chance to start over. Those who volunteered gave up their freedom, signing contracts that allowed them to be beaten, bled, and possibly killed for public amusement. They trained in ludi, gladiator schools, where they were branded, numbered, and drilled like soldiers. There were many such schools, but the largest and most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected by underground tunnels to the Colosseum itself. From the outside, these schools looked like prisons. On the inside, they were brutal factories for producing performers. Gladiators were divided into types, each with specific armor, weapons, and fighting style. The Murmillo fought with a heavy shield and short sword. The Retiarius fought with a net and trident. The Secutor was designed to chase. The Threx used a curved blade and small shield. Each type had its own rhythm, its own purpose. They were paired not at random, but for contrast: speed versus strength, armor versus agility. It was not just fighting, it was choreography, a deadly ballet. And each fight was about more than just blood. It was about image. The Roman audience was not passive. They watched closely. They booed. They cheered. They placed bets. They studied the style of each fighter the way modern fans study sports stats. They loved drama. A man who fought bravely and died well could be remembered forever. A man who begged, hesitated, or ran, he was booed, jeered, sometimes even killed after surrender just for disappointing the crowd. This obsession with violence was not seen as strange by the Romans. To them, it was part of life. Strength was celebrated, weakness was punished, blood was a symbol of honor, death was a stage. And the emperor, sitting high above the crowd, was both sponsor and judge. Sometimes he would give mercy. More often, he would let the crowd decide. And the crowd, once stirred, rarely asked for kindness. It is easy to think of these games as savage, as primitive. But the truth is, they were structured, rehearsed, even regulated. There were referees, rules, and medics. Injured fighters were patched up between shows. Some were given rest periods. Some earned prize money. The best fighters became celebrities, with fans, graffiti, and sponsors. They could even be granted freedom, a wooden sword called a rudis, marking them as a man who had earned his release. But very few lived that long. Most died in the arena. If not in their first year, then soon after. Some died from wounds, some from infection, some from sheer exhaustion. They were replaceable. There was always another man waiting in the wings, another hungry volunteer, another prisoner promised a chance. In the next part, we will step into the ludus itself, the training ground where gladiators lived, bled, and waited. We will see how they ate, how they slept, how they trained, and how they dealt with the long, anxious days between battles. Because in many ways, it was not the arena that broke them. It was everything that led up to it. If the Roman arena was the grand stage, the ludus was the cage that prepared you for it. This was not a school in the way most of us imagine schools. There were no books, no lectures, no time off for good behavior. The ludus was a training ground built like a prison. Tall walls, locked gates, guards who watched you more like property than people. And if you had dreams of escape, forget it. The Roman Empire had a way of finding what it wanted, and if it lost you, it would replace you faster than you could untie your sandals. Most gladiators lived inside the ludus full time. There were no quick strolls around the city or evenings off to visit friends. You lived where you trained. You slept in dormitory-style cells, usually shared with another fighter. The air was hot and stale, especially during the summer. There were no windows, just slits in the walls that let in dry air and distant echoes of Rome's streets. Your bed, if you can call it that, was a wooden platform with straw on top. If the straw was moldy or full of lice, you picked through it and dealt with it. Blankets were coarse. Pillows were rare. You did not sleep to dream, you slept to survive. Because when the sun came up, you would be run ragged until it went down again. A typical day began early. Before the city outside had even stirred, the lanista, the man who owned and trained you, made his rounds. He would inspect the men, check injuries, sometimes bark out instructions. He was not your coach in the modern sense. He was your master. He had the power to punish you, lease you, or sell you. He could deny you food. He could arrange a fight. And if he thought you were not trying hard enough, he could replace you with someone more desperate. Training began after a simple breakfast, usually a bowl of barley porridge or boiled beans. You might get a crust of bread, sometimes a small fig if supplies were good. Meat was rare. Fats and oils were more common not for flavor, but for building bulk. A fatter gladiator survived longer. It was not about health or nutrition. It was about keeping you alive just long enough to make money off your fights. The training yard was brutal. Open air, packed dirt, and the smell of sweat, blood, and metal. You trained with rudas wooden swords heavier than real ones, meant to build strength and discipline. You were taught to lunge, parry, strike, and fall. Repetition ruled the day. You did the same drills hundreds of times until they became second nature. You were trained to protect your exposed areas, to read your opponent's eyes, and to always fight with performance in mind. Because the arena was not just a battle, it was a show. There were sparring matches, too, often more violent than necessary. These were real men with real injuries, practicing with tools that could still break bones. There were referees, but little sympathy. You might be paired with a fresh recruit one day and a seasoned killer the next. And if you lost a tooth or broke a finger, you wrapped it and kept going. Armor and weapons were fitted to your gladiator class. Some fighters wore heavy helmets with tiny eye holes that reduced vision to a narrow tunnel. Others had nothing to protect the head at all. Some classes used round shields and curved swords, others nets and tridents. You trained in your gear constantly. Even if it cut, pinched, or weighed you down, you wore it until it became a second skin. And training did not end when the body gave out. Mental drills followed. The lanista might make you recite tactics, fight sequences, or even rehearse death scenes. Yes, that was part of the job too. Knowing how to die well dramatically, honorably, with your eyes open and your chest out could win the crowd. A well-timed collapse or a dramatic final breath might convince a sponsor to spare you. Or, at the very least, it made for good theater. Some gladiators had moments of relief between training sessions. They might be allowed to rest, bathe, or receive visitors. Sometimes women came, wealthy Roman women known for their fascination with gladiators. These were not romantic affairs. Gladiators were viewed as thrilling, exotic, dangerous. The attraction was one-sided. The women were free. The men were chained. And not everyone had visitors. Most were forgotten. Prisoners from distant lands, criminals, or men too poor to have family in Rome. The only real company was each other. Fighters formed bonds. They shared advice, jokes, and scraps of food. They wrapped each other's wounds and sometimes whispered about escape, even if they knew it would never happen. Punishment was common. If you disobeyed, you might be beaten, starved, or placed in solitary confinement. There were darker rumors, too, of men forced to fight to the death as punishment, or thrown to animals during practice. The lanista had near total control. Gladiators were assets. When they stopped performing, they were discarded. But the ludus was not only a place of brutality, it was also strangely efficient. Medical care, for instance, was better than for most of Rome's poor. Not because the trainers were kind, but because a healthy gladiator was more profitable than a sick one. Broken bones were set, infections were treated, cuts were stitched, you were repaired but never coddled. At night, the ludus grew quiet. The torchlight flickered across stone walls. The moans of injured men echoed through corridors. Some prayed. Others wept quietly. You never knew if tomorrow's training would lead to an arena, and you never knew if the arena meant death. You slept with one ear open and your hand near your side. Trust was rare. And even in the stillness, you felt the weight of eyes. The city never stopped watching. You were a spectacle in waiting, a showpiece in training. Even your pain had an audience. In the next part, we will follow a gladiator's journey into the arena from the rituals of preparation to the moment the gates open and the crowd roars. We will walk through every beat of the fight itself, not as a movie moment, but as a raw, tense, minute-by-minute test of survival in the most unforgiving theater of the Roman world. There is a certain kind of silence that comes before a fight, not the peaceful kind, not the quiet of a calm morning. This silence is heavy. It presses on your chest. It sits behind your ears. For a gladiator, the day of a fight began with that silence and a feeling in the stomach that mixed fear, hunger, and resignation into a single nauseating lump. No one spoke much when the sun first touched the stone walls of the ludus. Some men stared at the ceiling, blinking slowly. Others prayed to gods they barely believed in. A few paced. One or two might hum quietly under their breath, not to be brave, but to keep the thoughts from slipping into panic. The lanista walked the halls without speaking, his eyes scanning faces. He already knew who would fight. You were told the day before. That way, you had all night to think about it. You rose from your straw-covered bed slowly, carefully. Everything felt heavier. Your arms, your armor, your breath. Breakfast was given, though few ate it. Maybe barley bread. Maybe a few figs. Some wine diluted with water. You were told to eat for strength, but who could eat when their hands were shaking? Then came the preparations. A medic inspected you briefly. Your wounds had to be closed, bruises wrapped. They could not risk sending a man into the arena who would collapse too soon. A good fight required drama, balance, suspense. Next, the attendants brought your armor. Each piece was familiar but always uncomfortable. The leather straps bit into your skin. The helmet, heavy and hot, turned the world into a tunnel. Your weapon was checked, balanced, handed over like a final gift. And then the oil. Your chest, shoulders, and arms were rubbed with oil to make your muscles shine under the sun. It made you easier to see from the stands. You were not a soldier, you were a spectacle. A living statue shaped by pain, hunger, and fear. If you had a nickname or a reputation, it might be whispered among the spectators already filing into the amphitheater. If you were a newcomer, your name might be called once, then forgotten. Once dressed, you were led out with the others, a line of men shaped by weeks, months, sometimes years of blood-soaked routine. The tunnel to the arena was cool, narrow, lined with flickering torches. It smelled of sweat, dust, and old iron. You could hear the noise before you saw the sky. The murmur of a crowd, the stomp of feet, the occasional shrill bark of a vendor shouting for attention. And then, the light. The gates opened, and the sun hit your face like a slap. The arena spread out before you like a giant open wound, massive, circular, framed by rows and rows of people. The Colosseum could hold more than 50,000. Other amphitheaters were smaller, but the feeling was always the same. You were in the middle of something ancient, hungry, loud. It felt like being dropped into the mouth of a god. Some in the crowd were already standing, waving, cheering. Others drank wine, passed bets, or shouted insults. Children leaned forward, pointing. Women waved scarves. You were a stranger, and yet you were theirs. For the next 10 minutes, 10 seconds, 10 heartbeats, however long it took, they would watch everything. A herald stepped out and called names. The crowd responded. Sponsors raised their hands. Trumpets sounded. The other man was across from you now, dressed in his own armor. His helmet hid his face, but you could see how he shifted his weight. Nervous, tired, focused, just like you. Then came the signal. There was no long speech, no dramatic moment of music, just a hand gesture, a shout, and then the fight began. At first, you circled. You kept your guard up. You listened. You waited. The crowd murmured, eager for contact. Your breathing became loud inside your helmet. Your sword felt heavier than it had during training. Every step stirred dust. Every feint drew a reaction from the crowd. Then the first clash. It was loud, brutal, the kind of sound that made your bones vibrate. Steel on steel, a grunt, a stumble, a slip. You adjusted. You recovered. You struck again. There was no elegance, no dance. It was not like the movies. It was fast, frantic, ugly. Real fights were full of missed swings, shallow cuts, and wild scrambles for footing. If a man fell, he rolled. If a helmet came off, the crowd gasped. If blood hit the sand, the cheers rose. You learned not to focus on the crowd. If you listened too closely, you might hear someone calling for your death, a child laughing at your pain, a man shouting a bet on your opponent. You tuned it out. You fought for survival. The referee watched closely. He had a staff. He would separate you if things got sloppy, but he did not stop the fight unless one of you was clearly finished. A man on the ground disarmed, bleeding, a man kneeling, arms out, waiting. If you were lucky, it was not you. If it was, then you waited for the verdict. The crowd watched the sponsor, a merchant, a general, sometimes the emperor himself. He would decide. If your fight had been brave and entertaining, you might be spared. If you had hesitated, turned your back, or lost too quickly, death was more likely. The crowd gave its signal, a turn of the thumb, sometimes up, sometimes down, sometimes sideways. Historians still debate exactly what meant what, but in the moment you knew, you felt it. If you were spared, you were dragged out by attendants and taken to the medics. If not, your opponent would finish the job quickly. A sword to the neck, a blow behind the ear. The arena could not afford messy deaths. It spoiled the mood. Back in the ludus, the survivors were silent. Some were treated for wounds. Others were congratulated. A few wept quietly when no one was watching. You had lived. For now. In the next part, we will explore the social world surrounding the arena, the fans, the gamblers, the sponsors, the lovers, and the politics that made gladiators into pawns of power and obsession. Because for every man who bled in the sand, there were dozens more pulling strings from the stands. The moment a gladiator stepped into the arena, his life no longer belonged to him. But what many people forget is that his life also never really belonged to just his master or trainer. It belonged to Rome, or rather, to the people of Rome, tens of thousands of them, packed into the stands with wine on their breath, hunger in their eyes, and bets in their hands. Because as brutal as the arena was, it wasn't a private execution. It was a show, and shows need an audience. That audience came from every layer of Roman society. The poor sat in the highest tiers of the Colosseum, squinting down from wooden benches in the hot sun. They brought bread, pickled fish, cheap wine, and wild enthusiasm. The closer you got to the arena floor, the wealthier the crowd became: senators, merchants, generals, priests. Some wore togas trimmed with purple. Others carried scrolls and betting slips, gossiping about which fighters had the best odds. Women were there too, and they were not quiet about it. Gladiators were objects of obsession, especially for wealthy Roman women. These fighters were everything. Their husbands were not dangerous, muscular, exotic, and unattached. They appeared in murals, graffiti, and dreams. Some women paid handsomely for a night with a famous gladiator, and while the men of Rome scoffed at this, they often did the same with dancers and slaves. Hypocrisy was cheap. Gladiators were not. Then there were the gamblers. They came early and sat near the action. These were men who knew the names, stats, and styles of every fighter. They could recite how many victories a man had, who trained him, what injuries he had suffered. They tracked wins, injuries, and rumors. They shouted odds across the arena like traders in a market. Fights were risky, but so were the payouts. One clean strike could make or ruin a man's fortune in seconds. Even graffiti reflected this. Carvings on city walls named popular gladiators and showed drawings of their gear. Some walls had tallies of wins. Others showed symbols for crowd favorites or mocked those who lost badly. One piece of graffiti found in Pompeii names a gladiator as the delight of all the girls. Another calls a man savior of the arena, with hearts scratched beside his name. These were not private jokes. They were public announcements. Gladiators, for a brief moment, were celebrities. But like all celebrity in ancient Rome, it came with strings thick, choking ones tied to power and politics. Every major gladiator game required a sponsor. Sometimes it was a senator, other times a general, and often it was the emperor himself. These men were not just paying for entertainment. They were buying favor. Gladiator games were political tools. A well-funded show could gain votes, calm a restless population, or distract the masses from bad news. Bread and circuses, as the poet put it, feed the people and give them something to watch, and they will not ask too many questions. Sponsors wanted drama. They wanted blood. They wanted the crowd to chant their names. If a show was dull, they were mocked. If it was thrilling, they were praised as generous and powerful. Some sponsors ordered rare animals to be shipped from Africa or Asia. Others arranged for elaborate battles with themes recreations of famous wars, naval fights flooded into the arena, or mock sieges with towers and flaming arrows. And then there were the executions. Before the main matches began, the arena often hosted public punishments. Criminals, traitors, and slaves condemned to death were marched into the sand. Some were forced to fight wild animals with no weapons. Others were tied to stakes and left to be mauled. These scenes were not just about justice. They were about reminding everyone in the stands who held power. The message was clear: disobey, and this could be you. Children watched this. They sat beside their parents, learning early what Rome valued: strength, obedience, spectacle. They learned to cheer when blood spilled, to laugh when a condemned man begged for mercy. It was all part of the culture. Not because Romans were heartless, but because the system had taught them that suffering, when packaged with fanfare, was something to enjoy. And while all this happened, the gladiators waited below. In the hypogeum, the underground complex beneath the Colosseum, men paced in the shadows. They heard the roar of the crowd, the stamp of feet, the cries of animals. They could not see the fights above, but they felt them. The noise traveled through the stone like thunder. Sometimes they peeked through trapdoors, catching glimpses of flashing swords or falling bodies. They were not alone. The underground held animals in cages, stage crews ready to lift platforms, and slaves who ran messages back and forth. The air was damp and hot. The smell was thick with straw, sweat, and blood. This was not a sacred waiting room. It was a dungeon beneath a party. And yet, for all its darkness, the system worked. The city cheered, the games continued, and the names of favored gladiators were remembered briefly. A man might win a few fights and be given gifts, coins, or even a fan following. If he was lucky and skilled, he might be awarded a wooden sword, the rudis, and his freedom. Some chose to leave. Others stayed, drawn to the strange, addictive pull of the arena. Where else could a slave become famous? Where else could a nobody hear a stadium shout his name? Of course, that fame was fickle. One bad fight, one unlucky slip, one sponsor in a foul mood, and it was over. You were just another body dragged from the sand and dumped in a common grave. In the next part, we will follow the journey of a gladiator who survived long enough to win his freedom. What did freedom mean after years in the arena? Could you return to normal life? And how did the public treat a man who had been both killer and hero, slave and star? Because surviving the fight was one thing. Surviving what came after was something else entirely. There were no guarantees in the arena. Most men died before they ever got close to fame, let alone freedom. But sometimes, after years of surviving fights, pleasing the crowd, and bleeding just enough to be exciting but not enough to die, a gladiator was granted a reward, a wooden sword. It did not cut, it did not kill, but it meant everything. It was called the rudis, and it marked a man as liberatus free. But freedom was not as clean as the gesture that granted it. The ceremony itself could be grand or simple. In the Colosseum, the emperor or sponsor would present the rudis to the victorious gladiator in front of thousands of roaring spectators. The crowd often chanted his name. The fighter, sometimes weeping, would take the wooden sword and raise it high. It was his signal to the world. He had paid his dues. He had survived the worst Rome had to offer. He could now walk away. Except many didn't. Some men chose to stay in the arena even after winning freedom. They became Octorati volunteer gladiators who continued fighting for money and prestige. To outsiders, this looked insane. Why would someone choose to go back into the sand after finally stepping out of it? But the truth was complicated. A freed gladiator had no land, no status, and few connections. He had spent years being fed, clothed, and housed. Now he had none of that. Even those who did leave often found life outside the ludus difficult. Imagine living as a weapon for years, only to be told to become a civilian. You wake up with scars covering your arms, joints stiff from injuries. You flinch when someone raises their hand too fast. You are recognized in the street, not as a man, but as a former killer. Some people cheer, others look away. Some mutter about your past. Freedom, in theory, gave you rights. You could marry, own property, work. But the social weight of being an ex-gladiator never fully lifted. You were known, yes, but not always respected. You might be feared, you might be admired from a distance, but very few would welcome you into polite Roman society. You were not born into a noble house. You were not educated. You were, to them, still a fighter, still a slave in the mind, even if not on paper. A few tried to open businesses. Some sold weapons, trained other fighters, or became bodyguards. A rare few taught in ludi, helping the next generation of gladiators survive what they had barely escaped. Others fell into hard times. No skills, no family, and no structure often led to poverty, crime, or death on the streets. There were exceptions. Some gladiators became wealthy if they had fought in many games and won valuable prizes. They bought homes, hired servants, even married Roman women. But these cases were rare. Fame, even in Rome, was not always the same as success, and while the crowd loved a champion, they quickly moved on when the next favorite rose. Some former gladiators tried to hide their past. They changed cities, took on new names. They grew out their hair or stopped wearing the marks of their trade. But the body never forgot. The way they walked, the shape of their muscles, the scars on their arms, all betrayed them. People noticed. Whispers followed. And it was not uncommon for someone to ask, "Weren't you the one who fought the Retiarius at the Spring Games 3 years ago? And you, weren't you the one who took down that Gaul with the hammer?" Even romance was complicated. Gladiators, while often adored by women during their time in the arena, were not ideal marriage material. They were considered dangerous, unpredictable. Some women liked that. Others tolerated it for status. But many were discouraged or forbidden from marrying a former fighter. Families did not want the blood of slaves mixing into their lines, even if the man had earned his freedom with grit and steel. And then there were the dreams. Former gladiators often suffered from nightmares, though they would not have called them that. In a world without the language of trauma or psychology, these men simply called it restlessness. They drank to forget. Some returned to the ludus not to fight, but to sleep near familiar walls. The clanging of swords, the bark of a lanista, the smell of dust, these things, though once feared, became strangely comforting. They were reminders of identity, of routine, of a time when life, though cruel, was clear. Others struggled with guilt. It's easy to imagine a gladiator as a mindless killer, but many carried the weight of what they had done. They had taken lives sometimes out of necessity, other times for show. They had seen men beg, bleed, and die beneath their blade. They had heard the cheers as another man's breath left his lungs. Even if you won, you lost something each time. The soul bruises just as easily as the flesh. So what did freedom really mean? It meant choices, certainly, but also isolation. It meant waking up and not knowing what came next, a feeling unfamiliar to someone who had every hour of every day planned for him. It meant walking through markets where no one shouted your name anymore. It meant sitting alone at night with a wooden sword on your table and nothing to fight but memories. And yet, some found peace. A few former gladiators built new lives. They taught, married, raised children who never saw the inside of an arena. They told stories around fires, not always the real versions, but ones with cleaner endings. Some became local legends. Others faded into quiet anonymity. And perhaps that, after all the noise, was what they wanted most. In the next part, we will turn our eyes to the women of the Roman world, not just the wives and noble daughters, but the slaves, the servants, and the female gladiators who stepped into the sand despite everything stacked against them. Because while the arena was mostly a man's world, it was never only a man's story. The Roman arena, at first glance, was a man's world. The fighters were almost always male. The trainers, the referees, the emperors, who gave the thumbs all men. But to think that women were not present in the story of the gladiator is to miss half the picture. They were there every step of the way, watching, whispering, paying, and sometimes stepping into the arena themselves. Let us begin with the spectators. Roman women were regular attendees at the games. Not just the poor or the bored, but noble women in silk robes, dripping in jewelry, seated just behind the magistrates and senators. They brought their children. They came with friends. They clapped, they laughed, they swooned. Gladiators, with their oiled muscles and blood-slicked swords, were more than just fighters. They were a fantasy. In a world where most women had little public power, watching a gladiator become both adored and feared was its own kind of thrill. Graffiti scratched into the walls of Pompeii confirms what the official records avoided. Women had favorites. They carved their names beside hearts. One bit of ancient graffiti reads, "Celadus the Thracian is the delight of the girls." Another simply says, "Crescens, the net fighter, makes the girls sigh." These were not mere observations. They were declarations. Gladiators were Rome's first sex symbols, and women were fully aware of it. The elite found this concerning. Male writers of the time wrung their hands in their scrolls, warning that noble women were becoming too familiar with the fighters. Stories circulated of senators' wives sneaking into ludi at night, slipping past guards with coins and favors, just to be near the men who bled for applause. Some tales were probably exaggerated, passed around by gossip-hungry aristocrats, but others had weight. There are documented cases of women being caught with gladiators, even marrying them, often against their families' wishes. These relationships, even if rare, spoke to something deeper. Gladiators represented raw power, not political or intellectual power, but the kind earned through pain, muscle, and survival. In a society where marriage was often transactional, and women were expected to remain demure, the dangerous, untamed gladiator held an allure that went beyond the physical. It was rebellion, a brush with the forbidden. But women were not only spectators or lovers. In some cases, they were fighters too. Yes, female gladiators existed. The Romans called them gladiatrices. Rare, but real. These women were not trained in large numbers, nor were they allowed to fight in Rome's biggest amphitheaters. But they did fight, often in provincial cities or during smaller shows, meant to amuse and shock the crowd. They were curiosities, spectacles meant to blur the lines of gender and tradition. The philosopher Seneca, always ready to grumble about society's decline, mocked the idea of women fighting in the arena. To him, and many like him, it was a sign that Rome had become too decadent. That women, once modest and noble, were now donning helmets and taking up swords. But despite the criticism, the fights happened. The records survive. A marble relief found in Turkey shows two female fighters, named Amazon and Achillea, squaring off with swords and shields. Both survived the fight and were granted their freedom. These women were often slaves or lower-class volunteers. They were trained in small ludi, sometimes even alongside men. Their gear was similar, though usually lighter. They wore short tunics or sometimes fought bare-chested, depending on the event and the sponsor's taste for spectacle. Their fights were not treated with the same seriousness as male bouts, but they drew crowds. The novelty was too tempting, the risk too thrilling. Life for a female gladiator was every bit as harsh as it was for men. The training, the diet, the injuries, all the same. The judgment, though, was double. They were considered vulgar by some, dangerous by others, and fascinating by nearly everyone. Some audiences cheered with delight. Others watched in horror. Either way, the effect was the same. People talked, sponsors paid, the games went on. Beyond the arena, women's involvement with gladiators took quieter forms. Wives of sponsors might help arrange events. Female servants in the ludus brought food, water, and sometimes bandages. Courtesans mingled with the fighters during off hours, trading stories and services. Even priestesses attended some games, offering prayers for the souls of those about to die. And then there were the mothers, forgotten by most, but always present in the story. Some women watched their sons go into the arena prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or desperate boys who volunteered for a chance at food and coin. These mothers did not sit in noble seats or carve hearts into marble. They stood in the back, silent, watching, hoping, dreading. When the crowd cheered, they flinched. When the gate opened, they held their breath. For them, the arena was not a spectacle. It was a nightmare dressed in sunlight. Women were everywhere in the gladiators' world, watching from balconies, praying in temples, whispering through curtains, clapping from the stands. Occasionally, stepping into the dust with a sword of their own. They were not just background characters in the blood-soaked theater of Rome. They were part of the script. In the next part, we will walk through the end of the arena itself. What happened when Rome began to change? When emperors turned their backs on blood sport and the games lost their grip on the people? We will trace the slow death of the gladiator system and what it left behind in memory, in myth, and in the bones buried beneath the sand. Because nothing in Rome, not even violence, could last forever. For centuries, the roar of the crowd was a constant in the Roman world. From the early Republic to the golden age of the Empire, gladiator games were the rhythm of the people. They marked victories, honored the gods, soothed unrest, and filled the silence of Rome with blood and noise. But no empire lasts forever, and neither did its taste for spectacle. The decline of the gladiatorial games did not happen all at once. It was not a single decree, nor a sudden shift. It was slower than that of fading, a loss of appetite, a quiet turning of the head. The change began not in the sand of the arena, but in the shadows of thought. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Rome was changing. The empire had grown too large, too unstable, and too expensive. Civil wars chipped away at its strength. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. The frontiers were harder to hold, the economy strained under the weight of its own ambition. And in the cities, people began to ask new questions about life, death, and the soul. Philosophy was one of the first cracks in the wall. Stoics, who had always been uneasy with the idea of people killing one another for applause, spoke more boldly against the games. Seneca, long before, had written that watching men die numbed the spirit. He compared it to murder under the pretense of entertainment. Others echoed him. These were not fringe voices anymore. They were teachers, scholars, and respected men in the halls of power. Then came the Christians. At first, they were outsiders, persecuted, ridiculed, even executed in the same arenas where gladiators fought. But their influence grew. Slowly, steadily, they gained followers. Their view of the body, of violence, and of the soul was different from the Roman tradition. They saw the games not as a celebration of courage, but as a sin against creation. Life was sacred. Blood should not be shed for pleasure. As Christianity moved from the fringes of society into the heart of the empire, the mood began to shift. One emperor after another tried to walk the line. Some supported the games openly, others reduced them. A few issued orders limiting how often they could take place, but the people still came. The old appetite died hard. The games were familiar, comfortable, part of the Roman identity. To end them outright was to admit something had changed, and Romans rarely admitted that without a fight. Still, the world kept turning. The costs grew steeper. Training a gladiator took time, money, and resources. Feeding the schools, building the arenas, and keeping a constant supply of fighters was a burden. The great empire that had once flowed with gold now had to choose between spectacle and survival. When plagues came, when crops failed, when enemies circled the borders, the games began to seem less essential. And then there was the Emperor Honorius. In the early 5th century, with Rome under pressure and Christian influence stronger than ever, he issued a decree that effectively banned gladiatorial combat. The Colosseum, once the beating heart of Roman entertainment, began to fall silent. There were protests, grumbling. Some private matches continued in secret or in the provinces, where the reach of imperial law was weaker. But the age of the arena had ended. Not with a sword in the sand, but with a whisper. What followed was not exactly peace. Rome would still see violence, invasions, collapse, rebirth in different forms. But the image of the gladiator, once so central to Roman life, began to slip into memory. The ludi were closed. The amphitheaters turned to ruins or were repurposed. Stones were carried away to build churches and fortresses. Grass grew where blood once pooled. The sands were quiet. And yet, the gladiator did not vanish completely. He lived on in stories, in faded mosaics and scratched graffiti, in statues whose names were forgotten but whose poses still spoke of combat. Children in the streets still played at being murmillos and retiari, swinging sticks and yelling to invisible crowds. The legend of the arena was too big to bury completely. As centuries passed, new eyes looked on the ruins with wonder. Medieval writers misunderstood them. Renaissance scholars romanticized them. And in time, artists, poets, and eventually filmmakers turned the gladiator into something else, a symbol. No longer a slave, no longer a pawn of the empire, but a hero, a rebel. A lone figure standing against impossible odds. Of course, the truth was more complicated. Gladiators were not all heroes. They were not all brave. Many were terrified. Many fought only because they had no choice. But myth is rarely interested in accuracy. What mattered was the feeling, the sweat, the roar, the defiance. It struck a chord. It still does. Even today, we speak of people fighting like gladiators. We imagine them as icons of strength, of endurance, of honor. But rarely do we think about what it actually felt like to wake up in a cold cell, to eat barley until you were sick of it, to strap on heavy armor knowing the next man you faced might be the last one you saw. That part gets lost in translation. In the next part, we will explore what archaeology has uncovered: the bones beneath the sand, the weapons rusted in the dirt, the tablets, the graffiti, the remains of schools and arenas that tell the quiet truths the myths forget. Because the gladiators did not leave behind books, they left behind scars in stone and bone. And sometimes that says more than any scroll ever could. Long after the crowd stopped cheering and the last swords clattered to the dust, the silence of the arena remained. The Colosseum still stands, of course, weathered by time and earthquakes, a hollow echo of what it once was. But beneath the arches, beneath the cities, and deep in the soil of forgotten amphitheaters, pieces of the gladiators still wait. Their stories, once drowned in cheers and blood, now speak through dirt, bone, and broken stone. The first and most immediate discovery that tells us about these men comes from their remains. In places like Ephesus, York, and Pompeii, archaeologists have uncovered burial sites believed to belong to gladiators. These are not the grand tombs of senators or generals. They are simple, sometimes communal, but they hold more truth than 1,000 inscriptions. Their bones speak plainly. You can see the years of trauma, fractured ribs, healed sword cuts, smashed knuckles, and worn-down joints. Some skulls show repeated blunt force injuries, likely from training accidents or repeated combat. In one case, a skeleton showed a clean hole through the side of the skull, likely made by a trident. Others had leg bones thickened from the constant pressure of heavy armor. But what stands out most is the consistency. These men were physically strong, well-fed, and had medical care that was better than the average Roman citizen. Their diets, confirmed by isotopic analysis, included high levels of calcium and carbohydrates, barley, beans, and mineral supplements made from plant ash. This lines up with ancient writings that called gladiators barley men. They were not lean and agile like modern athletes. They were thick, muscular, padded with mass that made wounds less deadly. Some of the most famous archaeological finds have come from Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, it froze the city in time. Among the bodies preserved in ash were gladiators and their families. In one building, believed to be a ludus, researchers found armor, weapons, training tools, and even the remains of a man who had likely tried to escape during the eruption, chained in place. One of the most curious items discovered was a piece of graffiti etched into a wall near a training ground. It showed two gladiators mid-fight, with names scribbled beside them. One had a crown drawn above his head, a mark of victory. The other had a scratch through his name. Just like that, in a few lines of charcoal, someone captured the tension of a real match. Not from a historian's point of view, but from the audience's. Graffiti, in fact, is one of the richest sources we have for understanding how gladiators were seen by the people. In cities across the empire, you can still find names carved into plaster, sometimes with hearts, other times with curses. People wrote messages like Spiculus, the darling of Rome, or Verus, winner of 15 matches. It was as if fans were keeping score, cheering their favorites, and adding a very human layer to a very brutal world. In some amphitheaters, inscriptions and carvings list the names of fighters, the dates of matches, and even the odds. One stone tablet records a match between two gladiators and notes that both were granted mercy, something that would have been rare enough to deserve commemoration. These little clues scattered across ruins and museum drawers stitched together a clearer picture of what life was actually like. Even the weapons tell a story. Gladiator gear, found in places like Pompeii and Carnuntum, reveals a great deal about their routines and expectations. The helmets were often heavy, with narrow eye slits, designed to limit vision and increase drama. Shoulder guards, greaves, and chest plates were custom-made for specific classes of fighters. Some had detailed engravings, not just for intimidation, but for showmanship. These were not practical weapons meant for efficient battle. They were tools of theater, as much for the audience as the opponent. In the city of Carnuntum, in modern-day Austria, archaeologists discovered a remarkably preserved ludus. Using ground-penetrating radar, they mapped out an entire gladiator school training halls, sleeping quarters, and even a bathhouse. It was the size of a small fortress. There were traces of where men had practiced, where they had slept, and even a small graveyard nearby. It painted a picture not of mindless savagery, but of routine, order, and discipline. There were other surprises, too. In the bathhouse, walls were covered with carvings, not just names, but drawings of horses, animals, and people. It was a reminder that even men trained to kill still carved little symbols to pass the time. They waited, they scratched, they left pieces of themselves behind. And then there were the cemeteries. Some gladiators were buried with honors. Not many, but a few. One tombstone from Turkey honors a gladiator named Diodorus, who was killed unfairly during a match. The stone does not just list his victories. It accuses the referee of making a bad call. Even in death, Diodorus wanted justice. His voice still echoes from the stone, angry and proud. These finds, while scattered, give us something more precious than myth. They give us truth. Truth with chipped teeth, cracked bones, and faded paint. Truth that shows gladiators were not silent brutes. They were men. Some were volunteers. Many were slaves. Some found glory. Most found pain. They were not heroes in the modern sense. But they were remembered, at least by someone. A fellow fighter, a trainer, a fan with a piece of charcoal. In the next and final part, we will bring the story to a close. We will walk once more through the dust of the arena, but this time with all that we have learned. We will remember the gladiator not just as an image or a symbol, but as a man made of fear, flesh, and endurance, because behind the spectacle there was always a person, and behind every myth a heartbeat. The sand has settled. The last sword has fallen. The cheers have gone quiet, fading like smoke into history. There is no more training, no more clashing metal, no more blood smeared across the floor of the amphitheater. What remains now is the silence, the kind of silence that settles over old ruins and worn stones, the kind that lets you hear what noise once tried to hide. The gladiator is gone, but he was real. Not the version carved in marble or imagined on screen, but the man behind the armor, the one who woke up with aching limbs and bruised ribs, the one who squinted into the sun as he was pushed into the arena, unsure if he would live another hour, the one who ate barley and beans because that was all his body needed to bleed just a little slower, the one who was stared at, shouted at, wanted and feared, the man who dreamed of home even if he barely remembered what home meant. We have walked beside him now for 9 parts. We have felt his fear. We have seen the scars. We have heard the roar of the crowd and the heavy stillness that followed every match. And we have watched as his world changed from center of spectacle to forgotten footnote in dusty scrolls. His journey was not clean. It was not glorious. But it mattered. Because in understanding him, we understand something ancient and something deeply human. Gladiators were not born. They were made, forged in pain, trained in routine, polished for public display. Their world was shaped by empire, by power, by the insatiable Roman need to turn violence into theater. And while the crowd screamed for blood, while emperors used them as pawns in grand political games, the gladiator endured, not because he wanted to, because he had to. What surprises most people is how long that endurance stuck. Even after the games faded, even after the Colosseum began to crumble, the gladiator's image never left us. He stayed in our art, in our books, in our fantasies. He became a symbol of strength, of rebellion, of defiance, and like most symbols, he was changed. We smoothed the rough edges. We gave him dignity he was rarely allowed. We imagined him as a noble warrior, fighting for freedom, earning honor with each blow. But the truth was far messier. Most gladiators fought because they were forced to. Their victories were often small and short-lived. Their deaths were not always brave. Their lives were rarely their own. And yet, that doesn't make them any less worthy of memory. If anything, it makes them more. Because the real story of the gladiator is not one of heroism, it is one of survival, of waking up every day in a system built to break you and managing to live anyway. It is a story of men, and sometimes women, who endured not just the blade, but the boredom, the hunger, the humiliation, and the noise. They lived in a world that watched them suffer and called it sport. And somehow, they kept going. Some did find freedom. Some walked out of the ludus for the last time, holding a wooden sword and a second chance. Some found love, even if it was fleeting. Others died in the arena, face down in the dirt, with only the crowd to witness their final breath. Each life different. Each death, a line in a larger story the empire never quite finished writing. What remains of them now is scattered, a bone here, a helmet there, a name scratched into a wall that no one bothered to clean. These fragments are not grand. They do not shine, but they are honest. They tell us that these men were real, that they were more than myth, that they were not just warriors, but people flawed, scared, hungry, tired, proud. And that might be the most important thing to remember, that underneath the armor, beneath the stage lights of the Roman world, each gladiator was just a man trying not to die. Today, when we see the Colosseum, we see a monument, a symbol of Roman glory. Tourists take pictures. Guides tell stories. But look closer, listen longer. Imagine the sound of metal hitting bone, the breath of a fighter in his last minute, the moment before the gate opened, the silence afterward. That is the gladiator's truth. Not the fame, not the cheers, but the in-between, the hard mornings, the sleepless nights, the slow healing of wounds that never quite disappeared. The moments when death stood close, and you had to look it in the eye and keep moving anyway. He was not a hero in the way we like our heroes to be. He did not ride off into the sunset or win the war. He simply fought the battle right in front of him, one match at a time, one injury at a time, one choice at a time. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the lesson the gladiator leaves us is not about courage in the face of enemies, but about endurance in the face of a world that wants to use you and forget you. Maybe the story he gives us is not how to win, but how to last, how to breathe through the pain, how to hold your ground, and how to carry yourself with dignity even when the crowd only wants a show. Because the crowd always leaves, the arena always empties. But what stays, what truly matters, is the human being who stood there, bloodied, bruised, still breathing. And now, long after the gates have closed and the sand has been swept away, we remember him. Not as a champion, not as a killer, but as a man. And that, finally, is enough. In the dry cradle between two rivers, where dust clings to the air and ancient winds whisper across cracked earth, a man rose from nothing. His name was Sargon. In the centuries to come, poets would call him king of the four corners of the world. He would be remembered as the founder of the first true empire in history. But before the palaces, before the victories, before the statues carved with his name, he was just a boy set afloat in a basket. The legends say his mother was a priestess, forbidden from bearing children. To save him, she placed him in a reed basket, sealed it with pitch, and sent it down the river. There, a gardener found him, a humble man in the service of the king of Kish, and that gardener raised the child as his own. Whether this story is true or not, it survived for a reason. The Akkadians would come to see Sargon not as someone born to rule, but as someone chosen by the gods to rise. The land he was born into was not a peaceful one. Mesopotamia was a patchwork of city-states Uruk, Lagash, Umma, and others, each ruled by its own king, each jealous of the others, each ready to take up arms at the slightest insult. There was no unity. There was only rivalry. These cities fought over water, over boundaries, over divine favor. And in the middle of it all, Sargon began to climb. As a young man, Sargon served as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a position of trust, one that put him close to power. But ambition does not sit quietly in the corner. At some point, and no one can say exactly how, Sargon took control. Whether through rebellion or intrigue, the king was removed, and Sargon took his place. That was the first step. He would not stop at Kish. His army grew. It was disciplined, brutal, and fast. He marched south and took Uruk, a city that had once been home to Gilgamesh. He took Ur with its towering ziggurats and sacred temples. He took Lagash and Umma, cities that had been locked in conflict for generations. And with each conquest, he brought the cities into a single orbit, not as allies, as subjects. The Akkadian army was unlike anything Mesopotamia had seen. Soldiers marched in formation. They used bronze weapons, spears, and composite bows. They were supported by supply lines and enforced discipline. Cities that resisted were crushed. Cities that submitted were taxed and absorbed. The chaos of independent kings was swept aside by a new order. One man, one empire, one name carved into stone across the land. But Sargon did not just conquer. He built. He established a new capital at Akkad, a city so central to the world that its name would later define an entire language. Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the lingua franca of administration and trade. The empire spoke with one tongue, at least in theory. In practice, the old ways did not vanish, but they bowed their heads. Temples were raised in Sargon's name. Inscriptions praised his might, his favor with the gods, his wisdom. He declared himself the rightful ruler of all Mesopotamia and then looked beyond. His campaigns reached into the Zagros Mountains to the east, the Syrian plains to the west, and perhaps even the Mediterranean coast. He claimed to have washed his weapons in the sea, a poetic way of saying he had reached the ends of the world. But even empires cast long shadows. Not everyone accepted Sargon's rule quietly. Rebellions flared. The city of Uruk, proud and old, rebelled multiple times. Sargon crushed them, but each time the cost was blood. And each time, the roots of unrest grew a little deeper. The gods were not silent, or so the priests said. Mesopotamia was a place where every event had divine meaning. A failed harvest, a rising flood, a solar eclipse, these were not random. They were messages, and if the empire began to crack, people would ask why, not in terms of politics or logistics, but in terms of sin. Had Sargon offended the gods? Had he ruled too proudly? There are hints, buried in later writings, that not all was well. One text speaks of how Sargon struggled in his final years, beset by rebellions and signs from the heavens. He ruled for decades, but in the end, his strength waned, his voice faded, and when he died, the throne passed to his sons. The empire did not fall with him, not yet, but something had changed. A tension had begun to coil beneath the surface. The unity Sargon had forged was held together by strength. Without his hand, cracks began to show. Still, for a time, the Akkadian Empire remained. It was the first of its kind, a single power stretching from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. Roads connected cities that had once warred. Trade flowed. Grain moved from fields to granaries to distant towns. Messages, written in cuneiform, traveled across clay tablets, stamped with the seal of the king. But behind the walls of Akkad, the world was shifting. To the north, the rains began to fail. The rivers shrank. Crops withered. In the south, old loyalties began to stir. Cities that had bent the knee remembered what it was to stand alone. Priests questioned the strength of kings. Soldiers questioned their orders. The land that had once bowed to Sargon's ambition began to lean away. And still the statues stood. Sargon's image, carved in diorite and placed in temples, stared forward with wide eyes and a calm face. His words, chiseled into stone, declared that his rule had been blessed by the gods themselves. But empires are more fragile than stone. They depend on faith, on fear, on the belief that power is eternal. And that belief was beginning to fade. In the next part, we will follow the rule of Sargon's sons, the struggle to hold an empire together, and the slow unraveling of a vision too vast for one generation to maintain. Because while Sargon rose from the river like a prophecy, those who came after him found themselves staring into a storm, and the gods, it seemed, were watching. After Sargon's death, the throne did not fall into chaos. His sons were prepared. He had built more than an empire. He had built a dynasty. The first to take the throne was Rimush, a man who inherited not only his father's power but also his enemies. The empire, though vast and impressive, was not calm. The city-states of Sumer, conquered and folded into Akkad's grip, were not content to remain quiet. Within the first year of Rimush's reign, rebellion surged across the southern plains. Cities that had once bowed to Sargon rose up. The old pride of Uruk and Lagash returned with fury. Rimush was not caught off guard. He responded the way his father had taught him, swiftly and without mercy. Records from the time describe brutal crackdowns, entire cities subdued, leaders executed, temples punished. It was war without illusion. But Rimush did not reign for long. After 9 years on the throne, he was gone. Some say he was assassinated by members of his court. Others whisper of betrayal from within his own family. The records are thin, the truth blurred by time and stone. What is clear is that the empire, though still standing, was becoming more fragile. Power had to be defended not just from rebels, but from within the palace walls. Rimush was followed by his brother Manishtushu. His reign lasted longer, and though he too faced uprisings, he turned much of his attention outward. He pushed north and east, launching military campaigns to secure trade routes and resources. The empire depended on the movement of goods. Copper, tin, timber, grain, and disruptions threatened not only the economy but the illusion of control. Manishtushu tried to stabilize the foundations. But again, his end came not on a battlefield, but in blood. He was likely assassinated, perhaps by palace officials, perhaps by a faction that believed the gods had turned their favor elsewhere. Then came Naram Sin. He was not just a ruler, he was a visionary. The grandson of Sargon, he inherited the legacy of the empire and tried to transform it into something divine. Naram Sin did not merely claim kingship. He claimed godhood. He called himself the king of the 4 quarters of the world and added a bold title never used before God of Akkad. His image was carved with a horned crown, the symbol of divinity, something no king had dared before. Some called it blasphemy. Others called it destiny. Under Naram Sin, the empire reached new heights. He expanded its borders deeper into the Zagros Mountains and pressed westward toward the Mediterranean. Trade flourished. Roads were secured. Cities were rebuilt and strengthened. Temples were constructed in his honor. In a famous stele carved in limestone, Naram Sin is shown climbing a mountain, leading his troops toward victory, larger than life, his enemies crushed beneath his feet. He stands alone, a divine figure ascending toward the heavens. But what rises too high casts a long shadow. During Naram Sin's reign, a great rebellion broke out, not from the usual southern cities, but from a broad coalition of forces in the Zagros region. They were known as the Gutians highland tribes, less organized, less urban, but fierce and relentless. Their attacks were not grand sieges. They struck trade routes, raided outposts, disrupted the careful systems that held the empire together. Naram Sin marched against them, claimed victory, and for a time it seemed the empire had held. But the Gutians kept coming. Their pressure was steady, like the rising of floodwaters. Then the rains began to change. For reasons still debated by scholars, the climate across Mesopotamia began to shift. The southern plains, once fertile and green during the right seasons, started to dry. The rivers ran lower. Canals cracked. Harvests failed. Year after year the yields fell. Famine spread. Cities that had once been rich in grain and fish turned desperate. People abandoned villages and moved north in search of food and water. Naram Sin's reign, which began in triumph, grew darker. Inscriptions speak of omens, of eclipses, of signs from the gods. One text describes how the great temples stopped receiving offerings, how the gods turned their faces away, It tells of 7 years of drought, of empty granaries and silent altars. People whispered that the king had overreached, that calling himself a god had brought punishment upon the land. The priests began to turn. Rituals failed to bring rain. The divine order that had supported the empire now felt broken. Rebellion was no longer just political, it was spiritual. Cities questioned not just the king's strength, but his right to rule. Still, Naram-Sin did not fall immediately. He fought, he rebuilt, he reorganized the administration. He tried to restore the flow of goods and faith, but the pressure was too great. When he finally died, the empire was no longer whole. It still claimed vast lands, but the grip was slipping. His successors faced a world that had changed. The Gutians were no longer raiders. They were settlers. The climate did not improve. The southern cities, once the jewel of the empire, became husks. Akkad itself, the mighty capital, begins to fade from the record. Whether it was abandoned, destroyed, or slowly swallowed by time, no one can say for certain. The scribes who once carved praises now carved laments. One surviving text, known simply as the Curse of Akkad, tells a story filled with sorrow. It says that the gods turned their backs on the city, that dust filled the streets, that the people wailed but no help came. The once mighty walls fell, the fields turned to dust, the markets were empty. And Akkad, once the center of the world, was no more. The poem does not speak of politics or strategy. It speaks of divine wrath, of fate, of balance lost. It reflects a people trying to understand how something so powerful could fall, how a king who called himself God could end in silence. In the next part, we will look deeper into the causes behind this collapse, not just the gods and omens, but the environmental changes, the pressure from nomadic groups, and the slow erosion of unity. Because empires do not fall in a day, they crack inch by inch until one day the light shines through, and by then it is too late to hold it all together. By the time Naram-Sin was laid to rest, the empire he had inherited and expanded was no longer what it had been. The walls still stood in many places. The titles were still spoken. The clay tablets still carried the seal of the king. But the pulse beneath it all had slowed. Something essential was slipping away, and those who followed him could do little to stop it. The heart of the empire, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, was changing, not in a way that could be fought with swords or banners, but in a way that seeped into everything. For generations, the great cities of Sumer had thrived on the seasonal floods. The rivers would swell, drop their silt, and leave behind fields of fertile mud ready for planting. It was a rhythm as old as memory. But now, that rhythm was broken. The rains in the north began to falter. The sources of the great rivers, fed by distant highlands, dried little by little. In the south, where the rivers emptied and spread into canals, the water levels dropped, fields cracked, wells emptied. The farmers looked to the sky, waited for clouds that never came. And when they prayed to the gods for mercy, they were met with silence. Famine does not declare itself with fanfare. It creeps in. First, the grain stores are stretched. Then the prices rise. Then the animals are sold. Then the children begin to disappear from the streets. And with famine comes movement. People leave their villages in search of food. They gather around temples and palaces pleading. They press against city gates. And when they are turned away, they look elsewhere. Sometimes they join the rebels. Sometimes they become them. But the drought was not the only pressure. As the land weakened, so did the bonds that held the empire together. The Akkadian system had been built on conquest. Each city that fell had been folded into the structure of rule tribute, governors, roads, messengers, taxes. But it had always been a delicate balance. Not all the cities loved Akkad. Many had bowed only because of fear, and fear fades when the king's armies no longer arrive on time or at all. In the distant provinces, local leaders began to act with more independence. Some stopped sending grain or tribute. Others raised their own banners, speaking of old gods and older freedoms. The idea of empire depends on belief in its strength, its inevitability, its divine approval. When that belief cracks, it spreads. And then came the Gutians. They were not a vast empire, not a single kingdom with palaces and temples. They were highland tribes from the Zagros Mountains, hard to track, hard to predict. Their raids had long been a problem, but in the final years of Akkad, they grew bolder. The Akkadian army, stretched thin and weakened by unrest, could not keep pace. The Gutians struck caravans, burned outposts, and disrupted trade routes. They did not conquer in the traditional sense. They wore the empire down like wind on stone. The cities that remained loyal were left to fend for themselves. Some fortified their walls. Some turned inward, clinging to old rituals in the hope of divine favor. Others surrendered to new powers when it became clear that Akkad could no longer protect them. And what of Akkad itself? The capital, once a symbol of unity, began to vanish from history. No massive ruins have ever been found. No great ziggurat still stands bearing its name. It may have been destroyed. It may have been abandoned. It may simply have eroded into dust beneath centuries of wind and war. What is clear is that it ceased to be the heart of anything. The later kings who tried to hold on after Naram-Sin faced a world that no longer believed in the Akkadian order. The temples were still there, but their gods seemed distant. The scribes still carved in cuneiform, but fewer and fewer tablets have survived. One by one, the cities of the south fell silent. Trade slowed. Rituals were abandoned. Granaries stood empty. Walls crumbled. There is a quiet grief in the way the records fade. No final battle is recorded. No climactic end. Just less. Fewer names, fewer words, fewer signs of life. The fall of Akkad was not a single event. It was a slow unraveling, pulled apart by drought, rebellion, invasion, and the sheer weight of holding too much for too long. It had been the first to rise so high, and that meant it was the first to discover just how far there was to fall. In the centuries that followed, the people who remained did not forget. They told stories. Some spoke of a time when a mighty king had ruled all the lands. Others warned of what happens when men reach too high. In the poem known as The Curse of Akkad, the gods are said to have grown angry with Naram-Sin. They turned against him, sent him omens, and when he built temples in his own honor, they destroyed what he had made. The poem speaks of dust filling the streets, of silence where music once played, of people dying with no one to bury them. It is not just history, it is mourning. It is a memory carved into clay, passed from hand to hand across generations. The first empire had come, and it had gone, and the land had swallowed its bones. But even in its fall, Akkad changed everything. The idea of empire did not vanish. Others would follow. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians. All would build on what Sargon had begun. roads, administration, unified language, royal power that reached beyond a single city's walls. The shadow of Akkad lingered long after the city was gone. In the next part, we will explore what happened after the fall, the rise of the Gutians, the dark age that followed, and the long silence that hung over southern Mesopotamia before a new power rose to take its place. Because the fall of an empire is not the end of a story, it is the beginning of a question. What comes next when the gods go quiet and the cities turn to dust? After the collapse of Akkad, the map of Mesopotamia did not fall cleanly into new hands. It crumbled. The roads that once tied cities together became paths for raiders. The grain that once flowed in measured tribute now sat locked in storehouses or lost in the dry wind. And where once there had been order, rough, imperial, but consistent, now there was only uncertainty. Into this silence stepped the Gutians. They came from the Zagros Mountains, the jagged eastern edge of the known world, where the land was steep and the people lived in scattered villages. The Gutians were not city builders. They did not raise temples to the gods of Sumer. They did not carve their names into limestone or build ziggurats that caught the rising sun. They were seen by the Sumerians as wild and unruly, barbarians, outsiders, but they were strong, and in a time of collapse, strength speaks louder than legacy. At first, the Gutians raided. They struck caravans, outposts, and minor towns. Akkad had once been able to respond quickly to such threats. But with the empire in pieces, there was no unified force to meet them. The southern cities, weakened by famine and their own rivalries, could do little to defend themselves. Gradually, the Gutians did more than raid. They settled, they claimed, and eventually they ruled. How they ruled is a harder question. The Gutians left few inscriptions. Their own language is barely understood. What we do know comes mostly from Sumerian scribes who lived through the aftermath. These scribes did not speak kindly. They called the Gutians cursed people. They said they knew no gods, that they destroyed crops and let the fields go fallow. They described them as dark, chaotic, and unfit to rule. But that picture, drawn by those who saw their own power lost, may not tell the whole story. The Gutians were not merely destroyers. They inherited a fractured land and tried, in their own way, to hold it. For a time, they succeeded. They took the city of Nippur, long a sacred center of religion in Sumer. Holding Nippur meant more than power. It meant legitimacy. Control of Nippur gave the Gutian kings a link, however fragile, to the divine order that had guided Sumer for centuries. Still, their rule was not welcomed. The Sumerian cities, especially in the south, never accepted them fully. Local leaders began to rise again. Not kings in the Akkadian style, but city governors, rulers, tied more closely to temples and local traditions. These governors began to assert their independence. They rebuilt their city walls. They revived old rituals, and they waited. It was a strange time, a space between stories. The land had known empire. It had known unity under Sargon and Naram Sin, but now it remembered what it was to be many instead of one. Each city returned to its own path. Some fought, some traded, some simply endured. The great ziggurats still stood, though in some places the priests offered prayers to empty altars. The gods, it was said, had turned their faces away. The drought did not end quickly. Years passed. Fields remained dry. Wells emptied. People continued to move, searching for places where the rivers still flowed. This movement spread unrest. Cities that could not support their populations grew unstable. Violence simmered beneath the surface. Yet even in this darkness, new seeds were planted. In the city of Lagash, one of the oldest centers in Sumer, a man named Gudea came to power. He did not call himself king. He called himself Ensi, a governor. But his rule was strong, and his vision was clear. He rebuilt temples, restored canals, and reopened trade routes. He carved his achievements into stone, in long inscriptions written in careful Sumerian. He praised the gods, but did not claim divinity. His rule marked a return to the old ways, but with a new understanding. Gudea's success was limited in scale. He did not reunify Mesopotamia. But his rise showed that the old traditions still had life in them. That Sumer, battered though it was, had not died with Akkad. Other cities took notice. Pride began to stir again. Meanwhile, the Gutians held on to the cities they had claimed. For a generation, perhaps more, they remained in power. Some of their kings left inscriptions, though short and rare. One ruler named Eridupizir claimed the title King of Gutium and King of the Four Quarters, echoing the Akkadian style. But their hold was never absolute. The land beneath them was shifting. In the city of Uruk, and farther south in Ur, new leaders emerged who rejected Gutian rule. They formed alliances, raised militias, and began to challenge Gutian garrisons. At first it was small. Skirmishes, raids. But soon it became something more. A campaign, a movement. From the city of Uruk came Utu-Hengul, a man who declared himself king not just of his city but of Sumer. He marched against the Gutians, and in a battle remembered in later inscriptions, he defeated their king and captured him. This was not just a victory in war, it was a symbolic reversal. The chaos that had followed Akkad was ending. The Sumerians were reclaiming their voice. The Gutians did not disappear immediately, but their power broke. City by city they lost ground. Their rule had lasted perhaps a century, but now it faded like a mist after a long storm. What remained was a land ready to rebuild. In the next part, we will follow the rise of the third dynasty of Ur, the empire that came after Akkad, born from its ruins but shaped by the memory of its fall. It would be different in some ways, in others eerily familiar, because the lesson of Akkad had not been forgotten, and the dream of empire, once imagined by a boy in a basket, still echoed through the plains. The fall of Akkad and the rule of the Gutians left Mesopotamia scarred but not shattered. Beneath the ruins of collapsed cities and abandoned temples, the old spirit of Sumer still stirred. It had never fully vanished. It had only been buried under dust, fear, and silence. Now, in the wake of rebellion and drought, a new chapter was waiting to be written, and it would begin in the city of Ur. Ur had once been a jewel of the south, a center of worship, trade, and learning. Its ziggurat had stood high above the flat plain, a staircase to the heavens. During the Akkadian Empire, Ur had bowed like all the other cities, but it had never forgotten its own greatness. When the Gutians fell and Utu-Hengul's victory breathed life back into the Sumerian cities, Ur rose quickly, and at its head stood a man named Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu was not born into royalty. He was a military governor, a man of order and discipline, but he was also a builder, a strategist, and perhaps most importantly, a student of history. He had seen what had happened when power went unchecked, when the gods were ignored or claimed by mortal hands. he would build something new, or rather, something old reborn. He declared himself king of Ur, and then king of Sumer and Akkad. This was not just ambition, it was intention. He would rule both lands, the north once dominated by Akkad and the south where Sumer had first flowered. His reign marked the beginning of what scholars now call the third dynasty of Ur. But in his own time, it was simply the rebirth of order. Ur-Nammu set about rebuilding not just cities, but systems. He restored temples, reopened irrigation canals, re-established trade networks, and most famously, wrote down a legal code. This code of laws, carved into tablets centuries before the better-known Code of Hammurabi, laid out rules for justice, property, marriage, and punishment. It spoke in the voice of a king who saw himself as a servant of the gods, not their equal. He rebuilt the great ziggurat of Ur. Its stepped levels, each smaller than the one below, rose once more toward the sky. This was not just architecture, it was a statement. The gods had returned. The balance had been restored. The divine order, lost since the days of Naram-Sin's overreach, was back in place. And at the center of that order was the king, not a god, not a tyrant, but a steward. His son Shulgi took the throne after him, and for nearly half a century, Shulgi ruled with energy, intellect, and a touch of pride. He expanded the empire's borders, restructured its administration, and claimed to have run 90 miles in a single day. That last part may have been exaggerated, but the message was clear. The king was strong. The king was tireless. The king would not repeat the mistakes of the past. Under Shulgi, the bureaucracy of the Neo-Sumerian state reached new heights. Taxes were collected with precision. Records were kept on thousands of clay tablets. Officials were trained, appointed, and monitored. Scribes worked tirelessly to track everything from livestock and grain to marriages and legal disputes. It was a civilization obsessed with order, a direct response to the chaos that had come before. But for all its control, the third dynasty of Ur also carried the shadow of Akkad. The ambition was back. Shulgi referred to himself in grand terms. He declared himself divine in his later years. He commissioned hymns praising his wisdom and power. Though more careful than Naram-Sin, he too tested the boundary between man and God. Still, the achievements of this era were undeniable. Art and literature flourished. Mathematics advanced. Trade stretched across the ancient world, linking the Sumerians with merchants from the Persian Gulf, the mountains of Iran, and the cities of the Levant. The ziggurats were not just towers. They were beacons. The Neo-Sumerian Renaissance, as it is sometimes called, turned memory into momentum. But empires, even restored ones, are built on fragile ground. To the east, new powers were stirring. The Elamites, long a thorn in Sumer's side, began to push westward again. In the north, tribal groups who had once served as mercenaries started to grow in number and strength. The climate, though improved, never fully returned to its earlier balance. Floods followed droughts. Trade routes could still be interrupted, and beneath the surface, not all cities accepted Ur's control willingly. After Shulgi's long reign, his successors inherited a system that was tight, efficient, and heavily centralized. But centralization can become a weakness. When something cracks at the top, the damage ripples quickly downward. Communication slowed. Regional governors began to act with more independence. The unity that had seemed so strong under Ur-Nammu and Shulgi began to fray. The final kings of Ur tried to hold on. They fortified the cities. They increased military recruitment. They offered rich sacrifices to the gods, but the pressure mounted. The Elamites struck with more force, raiding towns, disrupting supply lines. In the south, rebellion flickered again. The very order that had been the dynasty's greatest strength began to turn rigid, brittle, inflexible in the face of change. In the last years of the dynasty, the great city of Ur was attacked. Its walls, once a symbol of renewal, were breached. The temples were looted. The palace was overrun. The scribes who had once written hymns now wrote laments. Their tablets speak not of glory but of grief. They describe the people crying out to gods who no longer answered. The city was abandoned. The empire was gone. But it had lasted longer than Akkad, and it had done more than imitate. It had remembered. It had tried to restore balance, and for a time it had succeeded. In the next part, we will explore what these collapses meant for the people who lived through them, the farmers, the merchants, the priests, and the soldiers. Because behind every fall of empire is the quiet struggle of those left behind, and their stories, though rarely carved into stone, are no less worthy of being told. While kings made proclamations and armies marched beneath carved banners, it was the people, the farmers, the scribes, the weavers, and priests who felt the weight of empire most directly. They did not sit on thrones. They did not lead campaigns, but they paid the taxes, watched the skies, dug the canals, and stood in the shadow of temples offering prayers they hoped someone would hear. When empires rise, they often rise on the backs of the quiet. When empires fall, those same shoulders carry the wreckage. The fall of Akkad was not felt first in palaces or in the halls of scribes. It was felt in the fields. When the rains began to shift and the rivers ran lower, the farmers in the southern cities knew long before anyone else. They watched the sky with growing unease. The canals they had once relied on became shallow. The earth, once soft and generous, turned dry and hard. Grain yields dropped. The barley was shorter, the ears thin. The season that once brought harvest now brought hunger. The countryside began to change. Villages emptied. Some people moved north hoping to find more water. Others crowded into cities, putting strain on food stores and social order. Families who had once farmed their own land found themselves working in temple fields, trying to survive on reduced rations. Many offered their children to temple service or bonded themselves into labor just to avoid starvation. In the markets, prices rose. A measure of barley that once fed a family for a week became unaffordable. Merchants grew nervous. With trade routes increasingly dangerous, goods stopped arriving on time or at all. The copper from Oman, the timber from the north, the lapis lazuli that had once gleamed in royal statues all became rare, expensive, and sometimes unreachable. Scarcity breeds tension, and in the cities tension turned to fear. Scribes, once secure in their positions, began to find their work shifting. Instead of writing hymns or recording shipments of grain, many turned to composing complaints, contracts for debt, and desperate pleas for legal resolution. A growing number of tablets from the later Akkadian period showed disputes between neighbors, legal challenges over food and property, and warnings about theft, violence, and fraud. The fabric of trust that holds a society together had begun to fray. Priests faced their own crisis. For centuries, they had been the interpreters of divine will. They watched the stars, read omens in animal livers, and led rituals to ensure the favor of the gods. But now the signs were unclear, or worse, clearly bad. Eclipses, strange weather, unseasonal storms, failed rituals. The people asked, why? The priests answered with ancient formulas, but fewer and fewer believed. The temples grew quieter. The gods, it seemed, had gone silent. In this silence, fear took on new shapes. Some blamed foreign invaders. Others whispered of forgotten gods, angered by broken oaths or disrespect. Some spoke of Naram's sin and the arrogance of declaring himself divine. In a land where the divine was deeply entwined with the cycles of nature, famine felt like punishment, and punishment required a reason. Within the cities, authority began to shift. As royal power weakened, local leaders began to rise. Some were priests. Others were wealthy merchants or respected elders. Councils began to take more control over daily life. In some cities, these new leaders brought stability. In others, they seized power and ruled by fear. Soldiers once loyal to the empire found themselves scattered. Some returned home, others became mercenaries, selling their skill to whoever had the silver to pay them. Bands of armed men, no longer bound by king or city, began to appear more frequently. They patrolled the countryside, sometimes protecting, sometimes looting. The boundary between order and banditry blurred. And yet, life continued. Even in collapse, people endured. The baker still rose before dawn to knead dough, though the bread was smaller. The potter still shaped clay on the wheel, though fewer came to buy. The shepherd still watched the stars above the hills, even if the flocks were thin. In the ruins of broken empires, there is always the quiet persistence of daily life. In some places, this persistence became resistance. Farmers rebuilt old canals by hand, without state support. Families formed alliances across city lines, sharing resources and watching one another's backs. Temples, though diminished, continued to perform basic rites. Births were still celebrated. The dead were still mourned. Stories were still told by firelight. One such story was written in the generations after the fall, a poem known now as The Lament for Sumer and Ur. It is a song of sorrow, but also a memory. It speaks of a world where the gods turned away, where the walls were breached, and where the streets ran empty. It does not name every king or explain every cause. Instead, it feels, it remembers. And through that memory, it preserves something essential. Because when an empire falls, it does not disappear all at once. It lingers in habits, in architecture, in language. The clay tablets still speak, even if the scribes who wrote them are long gone. The fields still bear the scars of ancient canals. The people who remained after Akkad and after Ur did not see themselves as the end. They were the next chapter. And they knew, even in the silence, that new voices would rise. In the next part, we will explore how memory itself shaped the legacy of the Akkadian Empire. How later kings, centuries removed, looked back at Sargon and Naram Sin and tried to draw power from their ghosts. Because the past, even in ruins, has gravity, and in Mesopotamia, nothing stayed buried forever. Long after Akkad's streets had gone silent, after its temples were swallowed by dust and its statues toppled by time, its name still carried weight. The people who lived in the centuries that followed did not forget the empire. They remembered, and in remembering, they reshaped it. What was once real became legend. The names of kings who had ruled with absolute authority, who had stamped their seals into wet clay and crushed rivals beneath chariot wheels, were now spoken with awe. Not as political leaders, as figures in a long mythic shadow. In the minds of later kings, Sargon and Naram Sin were not only rulers of men, they were chosen, fated, even divine. Sargon, in particular, became larger than life. Stories about him began to grow, not in dusty corners of history, but in the very courts of future empires. Later rulers, especially in the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, told tales of his humble beginnings. The boy set afloat in a basket, the gardener who found him, his rise from obscurity to mastery over the world. These were not simply historical details. They were signs of destiny. The more time passed, the more perfect the story became. Sargon was remembered not as a man with flaws and failures, but as an ideal, the conqueror of the world, the founder of unity, the original king. And as with many figures elevated by memory, what was inconvenient was forgotten. What was glorious remained. Later scribes wrote down these stories. They composed royal inscriptions that borrowed the language of Akkad. They repeated the titles King of the Four Quarters, King of Sumer and Akkad. And in doing so, they tried to borrow some of the power that still clung to those old names. If Sargon had ruled the world, then to echo his name was to share in that power. Naram Sin, too, became a legend, though in a different way. He was remembered not only for his strength, but for his pride. His divine status, once proclaimed in stone and celebrated in life, became a warning. The Curse of Akkad, a poetic text written long after his reign, tells of how he angered the gods. In that tale, Naram Sin sees signs of divine displeasure. He consults the priests, who tell him to wait, but he grows impatient. He launches an attack on the temple of Enlil, the great god of air and order. In response, the gods unleash destruction, famine, rebellion, invasion. The empire collapses. Akkad is lost. This story, whether true or not, became part of how later generations understood empire itself. It was a warning about overreach, about forgetting one's place, about the danger of claiming divine power too boldly. The kings who followed remembered Naram Sin not only as a mighty ruler, but as a man who crossed a line. And they were careful, at least in public, to show humility in the face of the gods. And yet, they could not stay away from his legacy. Like Sargon, Naram Sin remained irresistible. His image, especially that famous carving of him climbing the mountain in a horned helmet, was copied and preserved. Rulers of smaller kingdoms commissioned statues in a similar style. They placed themselves in heroic poses. They spoke of destiny and conquest, always with a touch of reverence, always with the hope that the past would lend them its strength. Even in cities far from the old center of Akkad, the memory spread. Clay tablets carried the names. School children in scribal academies copied out royal inscriptions from the time of Akkad as practice. They learned to write the name Sargon with careful hands, not just as a history lesson, but as a model of greatness. The empire may have fallen, but its language lived on. Akkadian became the diplomatic tongue of the ancient Near East for centuries. It was spoken and written by people who had never seen Akkad itself. In temples and courts across Mesopotamia, the Akkadian past became a kind of mirror. Kings looked into it to see their own reflections, sometimes to flatter themselves, sometimes to caution themselves. Sargon had ruled everything. Naram Sin had touched the sky. But both were gone. Their cities had fallen. Their gods had gone silent. For some, this was a comfort, proof that no power lasted forever. For others, it was a challenge, a reason to try again. The Assyrians, centuries after the fall of Akkad, claimed direct descent from Sargon. Their kings took his name Sargon of Assyria, ruled with an iron hand, building palaces and roads, carving his victories into stone. He wanted the world to know that the spirit of Akkad still lived in him, that he was not starting something new, he was continuing something eternal. The Babylonians, too, looked back. Hammurabi, who wrote his own famous law code, did so with the memory of Akkad behind him. He understood that law and kingship were not only tools of control, but symbols of divine favor. He ruled from a city older than Akkad, but he ruled in a world that Sargon had shaped. And even after the empires faded again, the memory remained. In every ruined ziggurat, in every broken statue, in every name carved into clay, the weight of Akkad lingered. It is easy to think of history as a straight line. One king replaces another. One empire rises and falls. But the story of Akkad shows something deeper. Power echoes. Memory bends. The past is not a dead thing. It moves. It speaks. It shapes what comes next. In the next part, we will explore the lasting imprint of the Akkadian Empire on the structure of kingship, on the idea of divine rule, and on how later civilizations wrestled with the legacy of those who first claimed the world as theirs, because the fall of Akkad was not an end. It was the beginning of a long conversation between past and future, one that would continue to whisper through the ruins long after the last king had been buried. When Sargon rose from obscurity and carved his name into history, he did more than conquer cities. He planted an idea that a man, not a god, not a myth, but a man could rule everything. Not just his city, not just the land around it, but the world. Or at least the part of the world he could reach with sword and seal. That idea, once made real, could not be undone. Even after the empire he built had crumbled, the shape of kingship in Mesopotamia was changed forever. Before Sargon, kings in Sumer had been closer to servants than masters. They were chosen by the gods to manage, to guard, to perform sacred duties. They were powerful, but they were bound. Bound by tradition, bound by the priesthood, bound by the rhythm of the land and sky. Their rule was local. Their power, while real, was still modest. But Sargon shattered that frame. He ruled as if power were his to claim. And because he succeeded, others believed they could too. Later kings, even in different cities and under different skies, understood that to be a ruler in the shadow of Akkad was to walk a narrow path. On one side stood ambition, the vision of Sargon, the image of Naram-Sin with his horned crown, ascending the mountain like a god among men. On the other side stood ruin, the memory of drought, rebellion, and divine silence. To rule meant to balance these opposing forces. In the centuries after Akkad fell, rulers across Mesopotamia borrowed from its model. They did not all claim divinity the way Naram-Sin had, but they adopted the idea of rule as a central, almost cosmic duty. They expanded their titles, echoing the Akkadian formula, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters. Even small kings in modest cities used grand phrases because they understood the power of language. To speak like a god king was to remind the people that greatness had walked the land once before and might do so again. The third dynasty of Ur, which rose after the fall of the Gutians, leaned heavily on Akkadian precedent. Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi saw themselves as restorers. They rebuilt temples, codified law, and reimagined bureaucracy with Akkad as a blueprint. They praised the gods with humility in public, but they also inscribed their greatness in stone. Shulgi even called himself divine in the later years of his reign. He had watched the balance. He had learned the script, and now he wrote himself into it. But kingship was more than ceremony and conquest. It was administration. Akkad had shown what could be done with scribes, seal-bearers, and a system that reached across distances. That lesson endured. Later empires did not just conquer. They organized, they counted the grain, they issued decrees, they kept records on clay tablets and sent messages from city to city on routes first cleared by Akkadian hands. In this way, Akkad lived on not just in memory, but in method. The Akkadian model also reshaped how kings related to the gods. In earlier Sumerian times, the king was a servant of the divine, acting on behalf of the gods. But after Sargon, kings began to speak as if they were more than chosen, as if they were necessary. The idea took hold that the king stood between the people and the heavens, interpreting will, giving shape to fate. Even when kings did not call themselves gods, they called themselves instruments of the gods, mouthpieces, arms of justice. That shift changed everything. It gave kings new authority, but also new risk. If a king claimed to be the vessel of divine will, what happened when the gods grew quiet? What happened when the fields dried up or the walls fell? The line between reverence and rebellion grew thin. The people could forgive hardship, but they could not forgive failure dressed as divinity. In Assyria, the idea of the powerful king reached new heights. Centuries after Akkad, Assyrian rulers still invoked Sargon's name. They built libraries, collected ancient texts, and styled themselves as heirs to the world's first empire. One Assyrian king, Sargon II, even renamed himself in honor of the Akkadian founder. He built a new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, and filled it with images of power and order. His rule was an echo, a revival, and also a warning. Because like Akkad, his dream would not last forever. Babylonian kings, too, looked to the Akkadian past. Hammurabi, one of the most famous of all ancient rulers, ruled from a city older than Akkad, but shaped by its memory. His law code is the most complete to survive, but it builds on foundations laid in the Akkadian and Ur periods. He spoke as a servant of the gods, but also as a supreme judge. His throne was not just a seat, it was a symbol of cosmic justice, rooted in a tradition born with Sargon's empire. Even in times of chaos, when no empire stood, the memory of Akkad lingered. In the laments written after the fall of Ur, Sargon and Naram-Sin appear like ghosts, warnings of what happens when kings forget their place. These texts were not mere nostalgia. They were instruction. They were lessons carved in loss. The legacy of Akkad also reached into language itself. Akkadian became the language of diplomacy and administration across much of the ancient Near East. Even long after the empire was gone, even in foreign courts and among different peoples, scribes wrote in the script first shaped in Sargon's court. Cuneiform tablets in Akkadian have been found from Egypt to Anatolia. The words carried meaning, but they also carried memory. To write in Akkadian was to step into a tradition that had once tried to shape the world. But for all its influence, Akkad was not eternal. No empire is. What Sargon began was not a formula for endless power. It was a mirror one that showed what kings could become and what they might lose. The lessons of Akkad were not always heeded, but they were never fully forgotten. Every king who raised a banner in Mesopotamia, every priest who anointed a new ruler, did so with one eye looking back. In the next part, we will look at how archaeology brought the Akkadian Empire back to life in modern times, how clay tablets, buried cities, and long-lost inscriptions slowly revealed the story of the world's first empire. Because even when the past seems silent, it waits. And one day, if the light is right and the earth gives way, it speaks again. For centuries, the Akkadian Empire was a whisper, a name without a face, a shadow barely visible through the stories of later kings and the fading echoes of temple hymns. There were no standing walls to walk through, no pyramids piercing the sky. The city of Akkad itself had vanished so completely that even its exact location remains a mystery to this day. What was once the center of the world became an absence, an open question carved into history. It was not until the 19th century, when European explorers and archaeologists began to turn their attention to the Middle East, that the Akkadian story began to return. These early travelers, armed with shovels, notebooks, and more than a little arrogance, set out to uncover the cities mentioned in the Bible and in ancient texts. What they found instead was a world far older, stranger, and more complex than they had imagined. Among the ruined mounds of Mesopotamia, they began to unearth clay tablets covered in strange, wedge-shaped marks. These tablets were everywhere. In temple ruins, buried storehouses, palace archives, even in broken walls. Some were cracked and blackened by fire. Others were perfectly preserved, as if the scribe had just set them down and walked away. These marks, known today as cuneiform, turned out to be the written language of the ancient Sumerians and Akkadians. At first, no one could read them. The script was dense, the symbols unfamiliar. But with time, patience, and comparisons to bilingual inscriptions, scholars began to crack the code. It was like learning to hear a voice that had been silent for 3,000 years. And one of the first voices they heard was that of Sargon. In tablet after tablet, his name appeared. Sargon of Akkad, king of the four quarters, ruler of Sumer and Akkad, and then Naram-Sin, the god of Akkad, conqueror of the mountains. Their titles echoed across time, scrawled in lines of baked clay. The Akkadian language, once thought extinct, was reborn in the mouths of scholars and translators. It was not just a language. It was a doorway into a forgotten world. Excavations at sites like Nippur, Ur, and Sippar revealed more than just tablets. They uncovered the bureaucratic machinery of empire records of grain deliveries, land sales, marriages, temple offerings, and military campaigns. These were not the grand inscriptions of kings alone. These were the words of real people, merchants, farmers, priests, soldiers. Their concerns were familiar, their fears were timeless. Through them, Akkad came back to life. One of the great surprises of archaeology was the realization that Akkad had influenced nearly every civilization that followed in the region. Its language became the model for administrative writing. Its concept of kingship shaped the theology and politics of Babylon, Assyria, and beyond. Its innovations in governance, taxation, and law provided the bones of empire long after its breath had left. And yet, the city of Akkad itself remained missing. Unlike cities such as Ur or Nineveh, whose ruins still rise from the earth, Akkad left behind no clear footprint. There is no ziggurat we can point to and say, "Here stood the court of Sargon." No walls have been confirmed as those of Akkad's capital. Scholars have proposed locations based on ancient texts, but the evidence remains elusive. It is as if the earth swallowed it whole and decided to keep the secret. This absence has only added to the allure. Akkad became not just a place, but a mystery. It forces us to imagine, to fill in the gaps with what we know and what we hope to find. And in a strange way, that mystery mirrors the nature of empire itself. Something immense, powerful, unforgettable, and yet so easy to lose. Modern technology has deepened the search. Satellite imagery, remote sensing, and careful surveys continue to examine the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. Somewhere beneath those plains, Akkad still sleeps. Maybe it was built with lighter materials. Maybe the river changed course and washed it away. Maybe the bricks were carried off by later generations and used to build new cities, layer upon layer of history folding in on itself. Even without its walls, the Akkadian Empire has left an imprint that cannot be erased. It lives in museum collections, in the quiet corners of library shelves, in the painstaking translations of dusty tablets. Scholars still argue over dates and interpretations. Was there really a drought? Did the Gudians bring about the collapse or just take advantage of it? Was Naram-Sin cursed by the gods or simply unlucky? The truth, as always, lies somewhere between the lines. But more than facts, what has emerged is a feeling, a sense of scale, of ambition, of a people who tried to hold the world in their hands and nearly succeeded. In their writing, their art, their systems, there is a kind of clarity. They knew what they were doing. They believed in their place in the order of things, even when the order failed them. And through archaeology, we are reminded that nothing is ever truly lost. The clay holds memory. The ground remembers. All it takes is one more dig, one more translation, one more unexpected find in the corner of a ruined archive to change everything. In the next and final part, we will return to the story itself, to the rise, the reign, and the ruin, and reflect on what the Akkadian Empire still has to teach us. Because in its fall, there is something deeply human, something we recognize in ourselves, and something we still have not quite finished learning. It began with a child in a basket. That much the old legends agree on. A baby set adrift on the river, cradled in reeds and pitch, carried by the current through a land divided by old rivalries and sacred walls. He was lifted from the water not by kings or gods, but by a gardener, a quiet symbol of how power can rise from the margins. That child became Sargon. The name means true king, and he lived long enough to prove it. Sargon rose from the soil of Mesopotamia and bent it to his will. He was not the first to dream of conquest, but he was the first to give that dream form. He built a capital, raised armies, and unified a patchwork of city-states into something new, an empire. From the marshes of the south to the foothills of distant mountains, his name carried weight. His face, carved into stone, became a symbol of certainty. His voice, preserved in cuneiform, declared not just control but permanence. But permanence is an illusion. His empire outlived him barely. His sons fought to keep it standing, battling rebellion, drought, and each other. His grandson Naram-Sin took power higher than it had ever gone before. He crowned himself a god and stood tall in carvings that showed him climbing toward the heavens. And for a time, it worked. The empire glowed with confidence. Temples rose. Roads hummed with trade. The gods, it seemed, were listening. Then the river shifted. The rain slowed. The crops failed. Cities starved. Enemies circled like wolves. Naram-Sin's strength could not hold back the dry wind. His divine title began to sound hollow. His empire cracked, then crumbled. Not all at once, but in slow, grinding ways that no king could reverse. The Gutians came down from the mountains, not as kings, but as opportunists. The land, once proud and structured, fell into disorder. And then silence. The city of Akkad itself disappeared, not in fire or flood, but in a vanishing act so complete that even its name became a riddle. The walls, the streets, the throne gone. No ruins remain. No bones of empire sit in open sun. Akkad became a myth buried under layers of newer dreams. Cities rose in its place, then fell again. Kings borrowed its names, copied its laws, invoked its gods. But the city, the heart, stayed lost. And yet, the Akkadian Empire did not die. It lived on in memory, in the scripts that outlasted the bricks, in the laws passed down through generations, in the very idea of kingship. Later rulers from Ur, Babylon, and Assyria stood in the shadow of Sargon and Naram-Sin. They studied the records. They mimicked the language. They dreamed of empires that could stretch just as far. They raised monuments, not just to themselves, but to the past, to the idea that once a man had ruled it all. The fall of Akkad became more than history. It became instruction. It showed what ambition could build and what it could cost. It warned of pride, of forgetting the gods, of ruling with too heavy a hand. It revealed that power, no matter how divine it may seem, still answers to the land, to the sky, and to time. When archaeologists uncovered the tablets, they were not just reading administrative records or hymns. They were reaching across 4,000 years to hear the voices of people who had built something extraordinary and then watched it break. Those voices speak with clarity, with pride, with regret. They are not frozen in the past. They are alive in the clay. We live in a world shaped by that same ambition. Borders drawn, empires dreamed, names lifted above others. The lesson of Akkad still holds. Nothing built by force alone endures forever. But meaning can last. The words carved by scribes who watched their cities fall still speak, not in the language of conquest, but in the rhythm of memory. And what of the people? The farmers who stayed behind, the priests who sang in temples no longer funded by kings, the children who learned to write the names of rulers who were no longer worshipped. They adapted. They endured. In their own way, they passed on the story. They knew that even when an empire dies, the land remains. The rivers remember. The stars still wheel across the sky. And in time, others would come. Build again. Fall again. And perhaps, somewhere in their stories, the name Akkad would be spoken once more. The empire that began with a child in a basket left no ruins we can stand in, but it left an echo, a shape in the imagination, a question. What does it mean to rule the world? And what does it mean to lose it? The Akkadians answered with cities and soldiers, with writing and war, with gods and grain. They rose higher than anyone had before them, and when they fell into legend. Now, when we speak their name, we are not just recalling a long-lost kingdom. We are remembering the first time humans looked out over all they could see and imagined it could belong to one. The first time they put that vision into action, and the first time they learned that vision alone is not enough. Akkad has fallen, but its story stands, and in that story we see ourselves.